I'm very pleased to be here. It's a great honour, and it's very, very good for my optimism to see so many people wanting to think about these questions. And some similar things are happening in my own university and city, so it feels very good to have this relation. The people who are sitting right against the wall here and there will have trouble because there are some pictures. So you may want to move around a bit or move in here. And I've been told not to walk around because of the camera, so I'll try and stay put. Now, I'm not sure what you want to discuss. So I will try to be quite quick so we have plenty of time to explore the questions that you want to talk about. And I may stop at intervals for some discussion, if that seems sensible. Okay. What I want to talk about, well, what I was asked to talk about was something to do with rent and the crisis. So I'm going to start with that, but then it kind of branches a bit onto some related questions. And we'll see what gets a response and what seems useful. I'm going to try and talk about four main things. The first thing, mainly, which is about the relationship between, if you like, capital, labour and land, between profits and wages and rent, roughly, in relation to the current crisis, and mainly with a British perspective or even an English perspective, and actually very much with a London perspective, because my daily activity is all involved with London and the planning of London and political struggles around housing and planning and land in London. So I'm not going to mention Greece very much, but we can talk about the parallels and differences if we want to, because you're the experts on Greece. But basically what I want to do there is to talk about the way in which social relations connected with land and buildings have played an important role in generating the crisis that we are in, and in turn are influenced by it. I mean, the connections in both directions, cause and effect, and both ways. So that's really the main thing. Then I want to say a little bit about the way in which these kinds of very commodified, very economic, very financial relationships penetrate wider areas of the society, the general commodification of urban space. Then a few comments on what role the built environment professions are playing. I mean, I'm a planner by profession, I suppose, and I teach students of architecture and urban planning and related subjects. So we're all the time considering what role these professions are playing and what they could be doing. And last week we just launched a manifesto which was aimed at professional planners in England to try to challenge the work they're doing, that we're all doing, and call for re-establishing a social purpose of this profession. And then lastly, say a little bit about the relationship between the wider processes of reproducing the society and land and housing and property and space. So let me start, and this will seem very elementary, but to me you have to start thinking about this present crisis by going back, as David Harvey calls it, going back to the way we got out of the last one. Going back to the 1970s and the way in which, after the 1970s, at different speeds all over Europe and the world, this whole shift towards a neoliberal, extremely deregulated capitalism, or differently regulated capitalism, came to start to grow and transform all the societies. And that over this long period, what to me seems most important is the way in which the total social product of our economies, of our societies, in North America, in Europe, and indeed the whole developed world, has increasingly been captured by profits and rents, with less and less, a smaller proportion going to labour, to the population which works. So this has been a long story of increased profitability over that period. And this accumulating mass of profit has been directed in different directions in different parts of the world. Some parts of the world, a lot of it has been going into mineral extraction and the exploitation of primary products. And this we can see a lot in Africa, and we can see it particularly in Australia and in the former Soviet Union. Huge investment in natural resource extraction. In other parts of the world, we can see this massive mountain of profits being invested into production processes, actual production of physical goods, especially in China and authoritarian regimes where labour can be made to work rather cheaply. And in some parts of the world, this profit is disproportionately put into land and rent and the purchase of assets. This concept of assets, of rights and property rights over land, buildings, but also other things like medicines and patents and copyrights and intellectual property. Because in the minds of these investors, this is the best way to extract part of the social product in these countries. And England, where I live, has been a very strong example of that kind of capital accumulation strategy by investors, to invest very strongly, not in production, not in mineral extraction, not much in agriculture, but heavily in buying assets, and a lot of that is land and buildings. There are lots of wonderful diagrams about this changing shares of total social product and how much goes to different places. Initially, these diagrams were produced only by Marxist economists and other extreme left people, but now you can find them in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the Economist, because everybody in the world now acknowledges that it has become a really, really serious problem. This one comes from an Austrian economist called Christian Zeller, and it's a useful one because what it is showing is that the share of total social product in the EU grew up to about 70, 76, 77, late 1970s, to reach its highest proportion ever, really. And then there is this long process in which that share goes down. It goes down in the EU as a whole from 67% to a level now of 55 or something like that. An enormous shift in the proportion of what we all produce, which comes back to us in wages and salaries. And the strange thing about it, and the thing which is nice about this particular diagram, is that he's put on the same piece of paper the proportion of social product which is consumed, is consumption. And this is the extraordinary thing, that consumption has remained very steady. It has not collapsed. Well, it has collapsed now a bit at the end of here, but in general it's been maintained, and it's been maintained mainly through credit, mainly through this huge expansion of credit. Credit for housing, credit for cars, credit for any pieces of equipment. But really, since the beginning of the credit card, it's really credit for everything. I can buy my grocery and food with it and accumulate credit even for that. And in England, you can even do gambling with a credit card on horses and football. So really, credit is available to fill the gap between falling wages and stable consumption. And you can look at it separately for individual countries. I looked for one that included Greece, but I can't find one, but the data is there in the EU statistics. I just should have spent some time to dig it out and put it on a chart, but this is just looking at different countries in Europe and the USA, Canada and Japan, showing that in all these countries that wages share of total product has been on that downward path, slightly different in different countries. And funnily enough, this morning on Twitter is another bit of it. Here is somebody, I don't know who he is, but he's quoting the Los Angeles Times, saying with obviously slightly different data, that in the United States wages fell from 53% of GDP in 1970 to less than 44% this last year, which is very dramatic. So this is a constant, this is now an acknowledged problem rather than a hidden problem. But I think it's very, very important context for the whole story. And it made me want to go and look at what had happened to the value of all these assets in which people invest. Investors put their money into the purchase of housing and land and office blocks and shopping malls and so on. This is the data for the UK. So this is just the UK. And it's showing what statisticians call tangible assets. That is, physical assets. Things you can touch and feel as well as buy and sell. So it's not financial stuff, it's tangible stuff. This blue part is housing. It's the national stock of housing at its market value, what it changes hands. The red bit is all the other real estate. It's the shopping centres and the industrial zones and office blocks and hotels and everything. It's the red part. The little yellow piece is agriculture. The purple part, which has grown a lot, is all the infrastructure. It's the airports and ports and cable networks and gas networks and water supply networks, all this pipes and wires and equipment which are now commodities. I mean, they are now privatized mostly and can be bought and sold and have money values therefore attaching to them. So in a way, if you think of all that lot, most of the total asset value is in the built environment in one way or another. And it's only this little bit up here, these top bits, which are the machines in manufacturing industry, and the aeroplanes and cars and trains and productive equipment, if you like, of the whole economy. And ours is an economy in which there is not much productive equipment left. It's been the subject of disinvestment for a long time, and the money gets put into other things. This is where it gets put. And this breakdown was very stable all through the mid-90s, and then in the late 90s it begins to expand. And every year I was getting the new data and doing the diagram again and thinking, oh my God, what's happening? It's exploding. And it really accelerated after 2000 and came to a peak in 2007. And of course, it's a self-fulfilling process because all this money raises the prices of these assets. This extra demand doesn't produce any more supply, it just produces a change of price. So up goes the money value of all this stuff. I mean, a little bit of this is new production. Some of this blue is new houses, but only a tiny percent is actual square meters of extra building. Most of it is just changes of the price. And when it stops, of course, it's very fragile and it comes down. So from 2007, came down dramatically to 2008, kind of was fairly stable for a year. Now it seems to be going down again. So to me, this is a very serious problem in any society where it's happening. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just exploring that. So this is a list of influences and effects and processes which together relate to this growth of land and property speculation and asset value inflation. One part of it is the weakening of other sectors, with the weakening of manufacturing. So money comes out of manufacturing, as disinvestment, and goes into these sectors. It's linked also with the fact that through these last 20 years, it's been possible to import manufactured commodities very cheaply from other parts of the world, especially China. So this availability of cheap food, clothes, food from some parts of the world, clothes and electronics and machinery from China, has made it very easy for populations to survive on wages which are static or falling. It's also been associated with a very strong geographical concentration of wealth generally in the world, but certainly inside the UK. Because the real estate in which investors are most keen to invest is in the rich parts of the country where good rents and high revenues can be extracted. So this is where that value, that money goes. So it increases the differentials between different parts of the country in terms of the wealth of individuals who own houses and of corporations which own commercial buildings and so on. We can talk more about that if we want. And it's in a country which has a very, very different from Greece in the way in which the ownership of land is historically determined that Britain is a country which never really escaped from feudal social relations. We still have kings and queens. We still have a church which owns a lot of land, not so much as in Greece, but a lot. We have an enormous aristocracy which owns very large amounts of land, both in quantity, hectares, but also in money value. Most of central London is owned by aristocratic families. The whole of Oxford Street, more or less, is owned by the Duke of Westminster, who is the richest man in England. He owns most of Oxford Street and Belgravia. So enormously massive, high-value urban landholdings. And I would say that the whole structure of law in England privileges land ownership very strongly relative to other interests in the society. We'll talk more about that if we want. But it's a country in which land ownership has a lot of privileges in terms of inheritance and taxation and the balance of power between the owners of land and the users of land. Still very feudal, I would say. So that's old. But recently we've had another important change, which is that in the deregulation processes of the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, a lot of rent controls and protections of security of housing have been removed. So if you're an ordinary family in England, in London, you live in a house and you pay rent to your landlord, which 25 or 30% of people do live in a private rented apartment. There is no control on this rent. There is no security of your occupation. Indeed, I had a terrible weekend last weekend because my son and his girlfriend, who were renting a flat from the landlord suddenly decided that he wanted to come back and live there. So he made them leave. They had 6 months in their contract, which is normal, and at the end of the 6 months, off they go. So they're homeless now, and they have to move back into our house, which is a very Greek sort of story. This affects the whole society very strongly. So there is really very little security now for people in the housing sector. Okay, I've nearly finished my list of things that are linked to this. This whole process of putting money as investments into physical assets has expanded into new spheres. I mentioned earlier that all this infrastructure is now privatized. So people can invest in railways and airports and ports and so on. But increasingly hospitals and schools and other public equipment and public buildings have also been privatized, so that they also are available as new avenues for investment and are part of this whole process. So what we've had is a kind of widening and deepening of the market for urban assets. Okay, now the last bit of this list is about the kind of consequences partly, that particularly in housing, when the price of housing units rises, this is of course wonderful for the people who already own their houses, because they sit there owning something with a rising money value which they can exchange if they want to. But it's very bad for tenants who pay rent, and it's very bad for people trying to enter the market to start with and begin to get their first bit of housing. So it has the effect over the years of a kind of to amplify all the social inequalities. Because those who have some money use it to buy housing, the price of that housing goes up, their wealth relative to other people goes up. The people who can't even start to buy don't get any of the benefits of that inflation. So it's a major part of the mechanism that reproduces social inequality and makes it stronger. And that's enormously important. Two last things. One is that in the UK, and I think in many countries, the system which used to provide pensions for workers after retirement has become very, very weak. It was, in general, quite a good system in England. Not very good, but adequate in a way for most people. But it's become much weaker for a variety of reasons. One is that pensions provided by the state are now capped or limited, or in some cases actually reduced. Not as badly as Greece, but some of that same effect. Second reason is that pensions which formerly were linked to your salary when you retire are now being replaced by pensions which depend on how much you contribute during your life and how well that performs when it's treated as an investment and placed in the stock exchange. So you are at the mercy, if you like, of the stock exchange performance of money which somebody else has invested on your behalf during your lifetime. So it becomes very, very uncertain. And many people started to save money for pensions in private schemes, private insurance schemes. But many of those go bankrupt or are corrupt or just stop paying. So there's a kind of panic about whether pension savings is valid or useful. And all of that is a factor which makes people spend even more on housing. They think that they will protect their retirement income by buying a larger house, accumulating wealth in the form of bricks and mortar. And often they will buy 2 or 3 houses and rent some of them out and live on the revenue from the rent. So all of these things are operating together and reflecting in this effects in the built environment. So I'm sorry to have such a long list, but I was trying to make the point that these relationships surrounding urban land and rent penetrate many different areas of social life. And that's the importance of it. Now, this crisis that we are in takes different forms, obviously, in different countries. Some countries are, in a way, perhaps a little bit recovering. This diagram, which I'm very fond of, is emphasizing the comparison between the present crisis and earlier ones. So it's taken as 0 as a kind of index, the peak of a boom before when a crisis starts. And then it's plotting what happens to GDP as it falls in the crisis and then as it recovers. So, for example, this very dark one here is the 1929-1930, which was a long and serious one, and it took 44 months to recover back to the starting level of GDP, and then went on upwards. The green one is a little crisis in 1990, which really only lasted for 30 months. But the one we are in now is this pale green one, which is going along steadily. So not only have we not recovered the level of GDP we had in 2007, but there's no sign of it recovering. And this is partly because governments are doing absolutely all the wrong things, and it's kind of guaranteed to make it worse. So we're in a very long, sustained recession. Not nearly as dramatic as what's happening here, but still pretty bad by Northwest European standards. Now, I said earlier that part of this whole story is a story of debt. And the important debt, I think, is the debt of households, not the debt of the state. The debt of the state is really not important. The debt of households is very important. And this is simply showing the growth of the household's family debt linked to housing. This is money borrowed to buy housing, by households in the country, which grew between the mid-90s and 2008 to be something like 1.2 trillion English pounds, something nearly 100% of GDP. It's really a very, very large and serious problem. And as I say, a lot of this was used to buy housing and effectively to drive up the price of housing. So the price of housing in the UK rose from an average of 50,000 English pounds per dwelling in 1995 to 250 in 2011. So that's quite a short period, and it's the price of the average dwelling increasing by 5 times. It is very dramatic. And for London, which is the green one, it's more dramatic still. Started off here at about 75,000 for the average dwelling and arrived at 400,000 now, or a year ago for the average dwelling. This is really insupportable and very dramatic and serious problem. Now, of course, there are many effects from this. There are effects of homelessness, there are effects of overcrowding, and so on. This is a diagram showing for London the growth of overcrowding, which means households where there are more people than rooms. That's our definition. We don't use square meters in England for some reason. We count everything in rooms. If you have more people than rooms, you're overcrowded. That's the measuring stick. And you can see it rising for London as a whole, and then it's separated by different groups. And the most serious crowding is in the social housing stock. About 25% of Londoners live in social housing still, and that's where the overcrowding is most serious. It's where a lot of poor families are with many children, and the stock is not adjusted for this. The stock is mostly small apartments with 2 bedrooms. So that's really a serious problem. This came out this morning. I was sitting there thinking, how can I revise some of these figures and get them more up to date? And this is in a report this morning from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is a very good, independent, quite progressive English research institute founded by some Quakers in the 19th century who made chocolate. Quakers all made chocolate because they were anti-alcohol. They didn't like alcohol. Somehow they all got into the chocolate industry and made enormous amounts of money. Anyway, and then just summing this bit up, this is a comparison of a whole lot of countries in terms of the average growth of the price of housing over a long period. It goes from 1970 to 2006. So that's 36 years, long period. And they've calculated the annual average change. Okay? And I think it's very interesting. We are at the top of this chart. We're really good at this. We're the champions, if you like, for house price escalation over 36 years. Really dramatic. Followed by Spain and Ireland, who we know are in deep trouble with their housing. Belgium, Netherlands, blah, blah, blah. Interestingly, the other end is Germany and Switzerland. Not places we think of as fragile, weak economies. Places that we're supposed to admire for their well-managed economy and so on. Very, very interesting and extremely serious kind of problem. Now I want to finish this bit by drawing attention to something which is a new and completely, I would say, disastrous aspect of land and property relations in London. It's new because it really only started about 10 years ago, and it's accelerated during the crisis. And it's the tendency of very rich people around the world to come and buy property in London, housing, residential property in London, for motives that we're not sure about, but they do it. They're doing it on such an enormous scale that it now takes up 60% of new production. 60% of the new production of housing is sold to people from abroad, which is fine. I mean, they have a perfect right to do it, but it is a serious problem for the city. This little diagram is about the proportion of people from different countries buying good quality residential housing property in London, which in the year 2000 was 75% British buyers. By the year 2010, it was down to about half British, half other. And by 2011, it was down to 35 or 40%. So it's a really dramatic growth of this thing. And the real estate agents who deal in this property with foreign buyers say that it really reflects the growth of the number of millionaires in all these different countries. So if you get a period when Brazil is doing very well, Brazilians come and buy it, or Russians come, or Chinese, or Taiwanese. And there are some breakdowns of exactly where, and I'm going to leave the slides and you can look at it at leisure if you're interested. And there is even some mapping of where different kinds of people from different countries like to buy. So these are the East European and former Soviet Union people. That's where they go. This is the Indian and Pakistani ones. That's where they go. This is where the Chinese go. The Chinese are different somehow. Their buying habits are different from these other millionaires. They like to be by the River Thames, especially. They like to be by the river in new buildings. They don't buy old buildings. They buy new buildings and they buy them on the river. Seems to be what happens. Just interesting, all that stuff. So there's a very strong market for that, and a lot of production is going on of luxury housing beside the River Thames or with views of the River Thames. Sorry? But I've been concentrating on housing, and I want for a moment to say something about the rest of it. This is what has happened to the capital value, this asset value of the non-housing stock. It's the stock of office buildings, retail buildings, and industrial buildings in the UK through two rounds of the crisis. So this was the peak in the summer of 2007, which in my view is when we had to start this story. People describe it as the crisis of 2008 or 2009, but it was very clear already in 2007 what was happening. Down go these values, then they recover a little bit in the following year, but they never get back to their previous level. And then at the end of 2009 they started recovering again, and some of them now are back in the positive territory and actually more or less back to where they were at the beginning. But it's very fragile, very unstable. And this is in London looking at the office market. These are the rents payable to occupy office space in the centre of London. And you can see this is a much longer time scale. This is from 1980. So this is showing this enormous surge in office rents in the late 80s, associated with the deregulation of banking and a huge boom in commercial banking in London. Pushed these rents up incredibly, led to a complete crash in that sector, not in the whole economy, but in that sector in the early 90s, and then that long building up to the 2000 this was the dot-com crash, brought it all down again, and on it goes. So it's a very, very cyclical, very fragile set of markets, which we try and study and make sense of, and which I'm glad to say a lot of students in planning and geography are quite interested to try and make sense of what is happening in these very bizarre processes. What I want to do for the last little bit is to concentrate on some of the other areas in which social relationships involving land and rent express themselves. And there'll be more about that in a paper which Pavlos and I are supposed to be finishing, which is a joint project we talked about for many years, where we write a big paper or book about rent. And I guess we shall finish that. But that deals with many of these things a bit better. But we've had, as all over Europe, and I know it's happening here a lot, we've had a lot of privatization of collective public assets, of social housing, where in Britain about half of our social housing is now in the private market. We've had a lot of privatization projects in the fields of health, hospital building, particularly schools and prisons. And this acronym stands for Private Finance Initiative, which was the name of a government policy about 15 years ago to involve private investors in the production of public buildings, which the state then rents back, effectively, from the private investors. It applies, of course, also to public utilities, gas, water, electricity, telecoms, and now increasingly to all sorts of other public services. And that actually produces a quite strong political opposition, somehow more than others. We had two particular dramatic cases which were politically important because of the opposition they aroused. One was in special care homes for old people, where there are some very large corporations which own and operate care homes for old people as a business. Sometimes they do it on a private relationship with individual old people who pay rent to live there, but often it's a relation with the state which pays the cost of the care home to the company. And one of these companies, which was called Blue Cross, I think, or Blue Circle or something, one of these companies had done a clever bit of financial engineering in that the company had passed the ownership of all its buildings to another company, I think registered abroad, and paid rent to the other company for the buildings. And the rent was enormous. But that was subject to a very low tax rate. It was very good for the corporation as a whole to have this tax regime for the rent. But then the company which actually operated the care homes and paid the wages of the staff went bankrupt. Couldn't pay the staff and the rent, effectively. So it went bankrupt, and for a while it looked as though all those care homes with thousands of old people living in them would have to close. And those people would be homeless. So the government had to enter and rescue the whole story. So this really showed people that this was a very dangerous kind of social change. The other one was the fire engines. That in London, the fire service for London, which is a public service, they had sold all their fire engines. You know what I mean by fire engine? The vehicles. They had sold them all to a financial company called Leaseco, and they were renting them back. But then this Leaseco went bankrupt. And suddenly the fire engines were not available, were about to become unavailable because they were now the property of a bank which owned them as security for loans to this company. So London suddenly was going to have no fire engines, which of course was rescued. The government entered and rescued the whole story, somehow saved them. These are very serious expansions of the sphere of private activity. So that's one thing I want to say. Second thing which is related to it is that it's becoming more and more clear, and I'm sure this is true in every country, that the housing market determines whether you have access to good or bad public services. And part of what people are doing in the housing market is to try to get close to the schools they want their children to go to, or other public services that they want access to. And in our case, it's particularly schools. And there has been a big research just completed about this, and it is clear that people will spend, who can afford it, will spend enormously more per square metre on their housing in order to be close to places where the schools are considered better schools. And more generally, this is, if you like, a market allocation of access to better public services. I'm sure it takes different forms in different countries and different cities because it depends on the rules which govern who goes to which school and the geographical catchment areas and stuff. In our case, this is a serious and big problem. And of course, access to green space and air quality. The air quality one is very interesting because air quality varies geographically at a very small scale. And particularly the air pollution caused by diesel engines, these small particles of minute microscopic dust which can kill you, are very localized. So if you're on a main highway, the level can be very high and really dangerous. If you go 100 meters away, it can be quite safe. Depends on the wind and stuff, but you get micro variations of air quality. And these seem to have a very strong effect on house prices, where people can afford to live. And what we're getting is a tendency for poor people to live on main highways where the air quality is worst, and richer people to live tucked away in quiet, secluded places with better air quality. It's quite complicated to analyse because it correlates with other things as well. And the quiet, tucked away places are also greener, lower density. But this kind of problem. Now, finally, a thing I'm interested in very much is how on earth a city can function with the kind of combination we have of very high rents, which are rising, and, though I haven't talked about this directly, low wages, which are falling. Half the population of London, I would say, are on low wages. All the people who work in shops, transport, cleaning, social care of old people, these are all low-paid occupations. It's almost half the population. Their wages are static or falling. How do you manage this situation? And I think that it helps to explain some of the things that are going on. One is that you bring people in from abroad. You can't reproduce your own population adequately, so you have to bring people from abroad. You bring in nurses trained in Sri Lanka and all over the world. You bring in doctors, you bring in engineers, you bring in software people from India. In a way, you're replenishing your human stock by migration. That happens a lot. It also is linked with commuting. That London can't accommodate its working population at a price they can afford, so people go miles away and travel long distances. And there is an enormously large amount of long-haul commuting, 50, 100, 150 kilometres every day, for people to live in places where housing is cheap enough, even after they've paid their railway ticket, to travel into the centre. So there's that as well. Part of this contradiction is met through subsidies to rent. So the state, for many years, has been paying people a social welfare benefit to cover some of the difference between their rent and their income. But this has become so expensive now in London, such an enormous burden of this subsidy, that the state is cutting it down. Government is cutting back on it. So that's ending. Part of it is met by overcrowding, which is by far the worst in London or anywhere in northwest Europe. So we are in a very serious situation. I'm just going to go on and quickly finish with some pictures, and then we can think about how to discuss this. One of the things which my students are always very concerned about, naturally, and so are we all, is what are all the professions doing in this? You know, what are we to make of the work of architects and planners and landscape designers and all these professions? Well, the way I think of it is that most of what they're doing is making, I call it sponges for value. It's as though they're having to design things which help to suck up and gather all this value that's floating around the world, kind of as though you were trying to gather it up and squeeze it into a bucket to collect it. I've been involved for 20 years in arguments about a big development project at King's Cross in London, which is really a lot of expensive housing and offices, designed to be one of these sponges, to suck up a lot of money to help pay for the railway. The project is sponsored by the railways and is part of the funding regime for the railway. So it's gathering money to finance the railway in a very interesting way. More generally, the central London area with the West End of the city and now Canary Wharf in the Docklands acts as a kind of sponge, gathering value, channeling profits into investors' hands. But that has always run up against the contradiction of the transport capacity. How can you expand continuously the employment in the centre of London with a 19th century transport system which is always breaking down? So you need a huge new investment in transport. And as you see, the transport all serves the centre. It's all these radiating lines. And there is enormous lobbying and public relations effort of the real estate industry to secure these investments. So these are public investments, public money, building railways, which valorise the land and property in the centre and help to keep this very centralised city going. And we fight about this, and we make representations to the City Plan Commission, and we go to public hearings, and we make a fuss about it, but it's very strong momentum. And I want to just give one or two more examples of this kind of thing. This is a couple of hundred years ago. This is a picture which one or two of you have probably seen before. It's a picture from 1815 of part of the port in London, a bit of it called the West India Dock, which was built by the insurance industry to protect the cargoes arriving in London. And it was cargoes arriving from the Caribbean, from the southern states of the USA and the West Indies. So this was the products from slavery. Yeah? There were these big plantations. The slaves were transported from Africa to work in the Caribbean, and the products arrive in London for realisation. So the value is coming home, if you like, through that slave economy. This is where it arrives, the sugar, the rum, and the tobacco, and all that stuff, spices. And on the same piece of land now is, it's called Canary Wharf. It's the same piece of land, is the financial centre, increasingly the main financial centre of London, with all the banks on the same piece of land. And it seems ironical to me, because in a way it's doing the same thing. It's part of this kind of global harvesting of value. You channel investments around the world and collect profits that are generated by work in China and work in Brazil and work in Australia, and you channel the profits through the city. And it needs buildings, it needs infrastructure, and that's it. And it provides work for a lot of our architects and planners to do. Can you put the light off a bit, because this is not a very good picture. This is an example of what I was speaking about vacancy. This is one instance of something which is happening in 5 or 6 places in London, which is that large social housing projects are being demolished to make way for new building. That's a part at the top. It's part of a large housing scheme built in the 1960s and 70s called the Haygate Estate at the Elephant and Castle. It had originally about 1,200 apartments, social housing. It's now completely empty. Or it's empty except for one apartment, which is lived in by my friend Rasco and his friend Adrian, and they are the last 2 people still living in this estate, and they are still fighting to stay. But in general, it's empty. And it's scheduled to be demolished, and the land has been sold to a real estate development company from Australia called Lend-Lease for a very, very low price. And they are going to build a new scheme, also housing, but mainly private market housing. So you get rid of the old working class population and you bring in a new population. Interestingly, it's designed by a firm called Make, which is led by the man who worked with Norman Foster and designed a lot of the famous Norman Foster buildings. A man called Ken Shuttleworth. So that's an example of something which is happening very strongly all the time. And this is one of the mechanisms for realising this right now. And we've got one even closer to home, because my own university I regret to say, its senior management, which makes the decisions, has decided that it wants to build a new campus. And it's trying to buy a piece of land near the Olympic Stadium. I mean, this is the piece of land. Behind it there is the Olympic Stadium, just finished last summer, and a kind of ornamental monument that sits beside the stadium. They want to buy this piece of land and build a new campus. The only problem is that this piece of land at the moment has a large social housing estate on it, about 700 dwellings, called the Carpenter's Estate. It looks like this. It's in quite good condition. It was built in the 1970s. People live there and perfectly happy. Interestingly, a lot of them are now private owners of their houses because they exercise their right to buy their unit under the privatisation. So they're quite hard to get rid of, much harder to get rid of. So now we've got quite interesting, tense conflict between the people who live on this estate, with support from some of the professors and some of the students in our university, versus the management of our university about this, and I don't know what's going to happen. Here are some of the students with their banner visiting the estate. And this is the architect's vision of what this wonderful new campus will be like. So I want to just end up again on this question of reproduction. But this is something which one of my students really made me think about. A very good student from Korea who did his PhD on all this. And his argument was that the real importance of this rent question is the way it enters into the cost of reproducing the population. And that rent can become such a big burden on workers' budgets that you can't any longer reproduce the population adequately. And this is going to be a contradiction for the national economy, quite apart from the miserable exploitation of the people involved. So I think this is a very serious and interesting aspect of the whole thing, which we probably don't think about nearly enough, and about the roles that the state may have to play in housing provision, or in rent control, or in transport planning, and the way in which all this affects segregation in the city and the disposition of social classes. And he did a very nice, in his thesis, he did a very nice comparative analysis of London and Seoul and Korea, which are very similar, very centralised, hugely concentrated employment in the centre, enormous long distances of travel, and Los Angeles, which is the opposite. And this little map is of the daily movements of people from home to work. And you can see that Los Angeles is very, very polycentric, really remarkable, quite different from what we're used to.
LP's
Sorry?
land prices.
Sorry?
LP's land prices.
Labour power. Sorry, Marxist jargon. Labour power. Reproduction of the working population, you could say. And their skills and capacities and good health. And it's a rather broad concept of the capacity and willingness and qualification and skill of the population to continue to work. Roughly. Anybody? I could be picked up on that. Okay, so in my view, this whole business of thinking about rent and relations with land and property is a powerful part of the tools we need to understand what's happening in cities generally, and in urban and regional development, which Pavlos is more expert on than I am, and in thinking about how the crisis unfolds and where it comes from and where it may go. So I'm basically encouraging people to think about it, and there's a list of some things to read if people like to read. So,
Thank you very much.